At 2:14 a.m. on December 17, 1944, a winter storm hammered the windows of Arlington Hall, the nerve center of America's code-breaking war. Ice rattled against the glass in thin bursts that sounded like distant machine gun fire. Inside, every lamp burned low to save electricity, leaving long shadows across rows of desks, cluttered with cipher pads, carbon sheets, dull pencils, and ashtrays filled with the exhaustion of night shifts that never seemed to end. Most of Washington slept unaware that, in this single building, a battle every bit as critical as the one unfolding in Europe was being fought in silence. Only one room still pulsed with frantic energy. The intercept line from Europe had begun spitting out a message 30 minutes earlier, a dense stream of encrypted German text that jammed the teleprinters. The signal operators flagged it immediately. This was not routine traffic. It carried the classification tag tied only to high-level Wehrmacht orders, the kind used when German command prepared large-scale maneuvers. The supervisor on duty, Captain Turner, read the first page, frowned, and ordered the message sent straight to the cryptanalysis floor. The message landed on a desk already overflowing with half-solved ciphers from earlier in the night. Turner muttered the same sentence he had repeated all week. How do they still have the resources for this? Germany had been cornered on most fronts, yet their encrypted communications had grown more complex, not less. The new variant of Enigma, an HL configuration with a supplementary rotor, had multiplied the number of possible settings. Breaking it in daylight hours took teams of analysts. Breaking it at 2 a.m. took a miracle. Turner scanned the room. Most analysts were half asleep, some finishing 12-hour shifts. Then he saw her. Mary Collins, 22 years old, ponytail, slightly undone from long hours, sleeves rolled past her elbows, pencil resting behind one ear. She was the youngest cryptanalyst on the floor and the one almost everyone underestimated. She wasn't military, didn't have combat experience, didn't drink with the officers, didn't brag. She simply worked quiet and precise, like she belonged to a different kind of war. Turner held up the intercept. Collins, new traffic, Enigma HL. Looks like a field order. Mary reached for it without hesitation. She barely looked up. Which sector? Turner exhaled. Ardennes. Mary froze. She knew exactly what that meant. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted just hours earlier. Reports coming in from Luxembourg and Belgium suggested the Germans were ambushing American units faster than intelligence could warn them. Communications were cut. Visibility was nearly zero from the snowstorms, and the Germans were using terrain familiarity to carve through the front. A single order, a single miscalculated movement could destroy an entire American regiment. Mary gently flattened the papers on her desk. She read the first page, then the second and the third. The cipher groups were tight, dense, unusually long. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't field chatter. This was an operational command directive, the kind issued before a coordinated strike. She tried to steady her voice. When was this intercepted? 30 minutes ago. Have we notified Sheriff? Not until we know what it means. Mary flipped through that pages again. She saw something no one else had noticed. 3 repeating blocks, identical groups appearing at uneven intervals. Not a pattern, a mistake. She looked up. How many American units are moving through that sector right now? Turner hesitated. The 8th Corps is redeploying east. 20,000 men. 20,000 men. Moving blindly into a forest the Germans knew better than anyone. If this message contained coordinates for artillery ambush positions or a shift in German armour, the consequences would be catastrophic. Mary felt the weight of that number settle into her chest. Her father had been a soldier in the First World War. He had slipped through gas-filled trenches and lived long enough to return home with his lungs damaged beyond repair. He died when she was 12. She still remembered the way her mother held his last letter to her heart as if it were a shield. She remembered thinking, even as a child, that war stole fathers from daughters in ways no weapon could measure. And now, she was staring at a cipher that might decide the fate of 20,000 families. Turner rubbed his temples. Realistically, cracking this will take 2 hours, maybe longer. Mary shook her head. We don't have 2 hours, Collins. This is an HL variant. Even British Hut 6 needs a full team to handle it. Mary pulled her chair closer to the desk. We don't need a team. We need time, and we don't have that either, Turner sighed. What are you proposing? She looked at the clock. 02:19 m snow hammered the windows harder now, covering the world outside in a shifting sheet of white. She inhaled slowly. Give me 14 minutes. Turner stared at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. 14 minutes. That's not code breaking. It's enough, she said. Her tone was calm, almost eerily controlled. If this is what I think it is, the operator made a mistake. That gives me an opening. A few heads turned. Analysts nearby looked up from their paperwork. Someone whispered, "She's guessing." Mary heard it. She didn't look away from Turner. "Captain, if we wait for a full team to assemble, those 20,000 men will walk into a kill zone. If we start now, I can get inside this. You're asking me to trust a hunch. I'm asking you to trust mathematics." The storm outside roared like an engine. Turner looked at the wall clock, then at the mess of encrypted lines on her desk. He knew they were out of options. He stepped back. "All right, Collins, 14 minutes. After that, we escalate and alert command." Mary nodded and pushed the papers into perfect alignment. She laid out her tools, one sharpened pencil, one dull pencil, a fresh carbon sheet, and a blank grid she had prepared earlier, in case of emergency. She adjusted her lamp to maximum brightness. Around her, the room fell silent. No one breathed. Turner looked at the clock again. "Time starts now." Mary rested her fingertips lightly on the first line of Cipher text. Her voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. 14 minutes. Then she began. "If you believe she cracked the code in time comment 7 right now, if you think 14 minutes is impossible, hit-like, this is where the story truly begins." By the time Mary Collins began her 14-minute race against an impossible cipher, the building around her had already lived 1,000 hidden battles. Arlington Hall, once a quiet girls' school in Virginia, had been seized by the US Army at the start of the war and transformed into the largest cryptanalysis center America had ever built. From the outside, it still looked like an aging academic campus, with red brick walls and gentle lawns buried under winter frost. But inside it pulsed like a second front line, a place where entire offensives could rise or fall, depending on whether a handful of analysts could interpret the enemy's intentions before dawn. The rooms were overcrowded, the lights dimmed the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and hot circuitry from hundreds of teleprinters. It was a world where time bent differently. Days blurred, nights stretched, and no one ever really knew what hour it was except by the growing stacks of intercepted messages piling on every desk. It was here that the United States fought a silent mathematical war against an enemy that spoke in wires and electricity. And it was here that Mary learned that brilliance didn't matter if no one believed you were capable of delivering it. Arlington Hall was run largely by women college graduates trained in mathematics, linguistics, statistics, and logic. More than 7,000 of them filled its offices. Many had been hired from universities, others from teaching posts or clerical jobs. Recruiters searched for quiet minds with an unusual talent for patterns. They combed through women's colleges looking for anyone who finished crossword puzzles, too quickly excelled at number theory, or could explain long-form probability without hesitation. The war needed that kind of mind, but it needed it quietly. To the public, these women were clerks, secretaries, or communication assistants. In truth, they cracked the codes that allowed generals to see the battlefield before their troops ever reached it. Mary had arrived a year earlier, just 21, with no combat experience, and no real awareness of the machine she was stepping into. She'd grown up in Pennsylvania, where winters were harsh and families were used to hardship. Her father, a veteran of the First World War, had returned home with damaged lungs and a body never fully recovered from chemical warfare. She spent much of her childhood listening to him cough through the night. When he died, the void in her home was filled only by the silence of a man who had survived trenches but not their memory. Education became her refuge. Numbers were clean, equations did not lie, patterns had reasons, and unlike war mathematics, didn't take anyone away without explanation. She enrolled in a university mathematics program where she discovered she had an almost instinctive gift for recognizing statistical irregularities. A visiting Army recruiter administering a routine aptitude test for the newly formed Signal Intelligence Service watched her complete a pattern recognition exam meant to last an hour in under 14 minutes. He didn't explain what the test was for. He simply marked her as a candidate and told her she would receive a letter. 3 months later, she stepped into Arlington Hall. Her first months were difficult. The men in the building held the higher ranks and dismissed most young women as temporary labour. They assigned Mary to repetitive tasks, transcribing code groups, checking number alignments, cleaning chalkboards, and collating shift logs. She obeyed quietly without complaint, but she also watched, studied, absorbed. She borrowed every technical document she could find. She memorized rotor wiring tables, substitution anomalies, and recalibration notes from previous breakthroughs. Without asking for permission, she began reverse-solving old ciphers for practice. Her supervisor discovered one of her solved grids in a waste bin and confronted her. Instead of reprimanding her, he asked her to stay late. From that night on, she was moved to the analysis floor. Still even there, she felt the weight of doubt. Male officers asked her to slow down explanations because her reasoning jumped steps. Others dismissed her results as lucky guesses. Once a colonel told her, "You're too fast to be thorough," she didn't argue. She simply handed him her solution grid. He walked away without another word. All of this shaped her, the silence, the scrutiny, the pressure, but nothing shaped her more than the machine she had been hired to fight Enigma. To most soldiers, Enigma was just a German typewriter that flashed lights. But to the cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall, it was a hydra. Each day at midnight, its internal rotors were reset to a new configuration, creating a fresh ocean of possible key settings, roughly 100 trillion combinations, before considering plugboard variations and rotor order. Even with machinery to assist, solving a single message could take hours. Solving it in time to save lives could take something no manual taught intuition, sharpened by an understanding of human error. Mary knew the machine intimately, the rhythm of its stepping, the ways operators slipped when they were cold or frightened, how repeated letters created echoes in the cipher stream. But the HL variant now being used in Ardennes was different. It introduced a fourth auxiliary rotor reserved for major operations. Only high-ranking German command used it, which meant any message bearing its signature was tied in to strategic movement. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had cracked some HL messages earlier in the year, but only with full teams and electromechanical assistance. Doing it manually in the middle of a blizzard with thousands of lives depending on every second, it was madness. And yet the stakes in December 1944 were higher than they had been at any other point in the war. Battle of the Bulge was the Germans' last gamble, their final attempt to split Allied lines and force a negotiation. The weather-grounded Allied aircraft, the forest-blocked vision, and communication lines were a disaster. American units were moving with incomplete intelligence, marching into regions the Germans had prepared for months. Any intercept from that sector could mean the difference between holding a defensive line or being swallowed whole by blitzkrieg. That was the message sitting on Mary's desk. 3 pages of numbers and letters translated into thousands of lives. A cipher so complex that most analysts would have set it aside until morning. But Mary didn't have the luxury of mourning. She had only the rapid movement of American troops pushing unknowingly into a trap, and the thin chance that German operators under stress-cold fatigue had slipped as they often did. The room around her buzzed with a slow burn of anxiety. Analysts whispered about the situation in Belgium. Some speculated the Germans had regained full operational strength. Others said the Allies had grown complacent. But only Mary saw the message for what it truly was, a hinge point in history. She slid her chair closer, steadying her breath, and began turning the dense block of characters into patterns, angles, and statistical flaws. She no longer heard the storm outside. She no longer heard the teleprinters. She heard only the ticking of the clock behind her and the faint memory of her father's strained whisper the night before he died. War takes everything if you let it. She wasn't going to let it. Across an ocean and half a continent from Arlington Hall, the Ardennes forest was collapsing into chaos. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to a few feet. American patrols stumbled through drifts waist-deep, unaware that German infantry and armor were threading through the trees with practiced precision. Reports filtering back to Washington described whole companies cut off before they realized they were under attack. Roads once believed secure were now death corridors. Radios went dead, artillery positions fell silent, intelligence officers called it the blackest hour of the European campaign. And the message sitting on Mary Collins's desk was tied directly to it. At 2:21 a.m., 5 minutes after Mary began her attempt to break the cipher, a runner burst into the analysis room with an update from the War Department liaison the 8th Corps had advanced farther east than expected. A clerical delay had prevented the message from being relayed earlier. That meant the 20,000 men Mary had been thinking about were even deeper into contested territory. Turner read the update in silence. The tension behind his eyes hardened. When he looked at Mary, the urgency was unmistakable. "They're in it now," he said. "If this is an ambush order, they're already walking into the jaws." Mary nodded once, not trusting herself to speak yet. She forced her eyes back to the 3 dense pages. The cipher groups were unusually long, more than what a standard field message contained. That suggested layers. German operators rarely used extended sequences unless delivering directives that required precise timing and coordination. Timed artillery barrages, structured tank movements, synchronized infantry pushes. Every instinct she had screamed that this message dictated something on a scale far larger than a simple repositioning. She began rewriting the first page onto a fresh grid, grouping the characters into patterns of 6, a method she used when searching for irregularities in HL traffic. Her pencil moved quickly, almost aggressively. She had already identified 2 anomalies clusters whose statistical frequency did not match the expected output of a correctly calibrated Enigma HL. That meant the operator had made a mistake, either in rotor alignment or in retyping from the original order. Under normal conditions, such errors were rare. Under freezing temperatures inside the Ardennes, forest, gloved hands, shaking fingers, numb mistakes were common, and mistakes were openings. Collins Turner said sharply, "Anything yet?" "Not enough to work with," she replied, "but I can feel a drift. The operator slipped at least once." "You're sure?" "Not yet, but the groupings aren't consistent." Something shifted in the middle of the second page. Turner ran a hand across his face. "We don't have room for guesses." Mary didn't look up. "Then good news, Captain, I don't guess." Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was the same calm she carried into every complex problem, an unflinching belief that there was always a solution buried somewhere inside the chaos, always a flaw waiting to be exposed. But the clock was burning. She could feel its rhythm tightening around her. On the battlefield, German forces were executing the opening phases of Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein Operation Watch on the Rhine, designed to break Allied lines and seize critical supply roads. They had spent months planning it, disguising troop movements, stockpiling fuel, embedding elite units, disguised as American soldiers. And now, in the darkness of the Ardennes, they were unleashing the assault with brutal efficiency. If the 8th Corps continued its advance along the marked roads, the Germans would isolate them within hours and crush them beneath coordinated artillery and armour. That was the background to the encrypted order Mary was trying to break. She moved to the second page and began isolating repeated digraphs that appeared at positions inconsistent with machine output. Her pencil scratched furiously, leaving dark grooves in the paper. She muttered to herself, not in frustration but in computation, as if speaking helped pull the order into a shape she could understand. This isn't a clean rotor shift. It's manual drift. Too many duplicates. He retyped mid-sequence. Across the room, 2 analysts argued in hushed voices about whether to alert higher command immediately, but Turner silenced them with a gesture. "We wait for Collins," he said. "If we send an unconfirmed alert, Schaeff will ignore it." Mary heard him but kept working, her heartbeat aligned with the ticking clock behind her. 12 minutes left. 11, 10. On the 10th minute she froze. She had circled a set of 5 repeated cipher groups on the second page. On their own, they meant nothing. But when she compared them to the groups on page 3, her breath caught. The distribution was identical except for one character in the 3rd position of the second block. A single deviation. A single thumb slip from a German operator typing in the cold. She whispered, "There you are." Something in her voice made Turner step forward. "What did you find?" "An operator error. Page 3 copied incorrectly from page 2. That means the machine's progression didn't match the original source. That gives me a fixed point." Turner blinked. A fixed point for what? To reverse the rotor stepping. She didn't look up as she spoke. She began translating the sequences back into expected HL outputs, subtracting 1 rotor step for each misaligned position. The moment she reached the corrected alignment, the pattern sharpened. The cipher, once impenetrable, suddenly bent into something she recognized the early structure of a German operations directive. Turner hovered over her shoulder. "Talk to me, Collins. What are we looking at?" "A structured command. High priority. The kind used to coordinate multi-division movements. I can't read it yet, but the skeleton is right." She moved faster, crossing out incorrect positions, aligning repeated sequences, stitching together fragments of real output. She was essentially unbreaking the operator's mistake to undo the Enigma's chaos. 9 minutes left. 8, 7. Mary reached the end of the 3rd page and sat back for a fraction of a second, eyes narrowed. Something was missing. A closing frame. All high-level German orders ended with a short sequence indicating time of execution. She scanned the bottom lines again. There it was, a truncated sequence incomplete due to the operator's error. She let out a sharp breath. Turner leaned in. "What does it mean? If I correct this sequence, we get the timing." She reinserted the missing character, reconstructed. The groups recalculated the plugboard mapping with estimated drift. Her hands shook not from fear but from speed. She solved the final alignment, corrected the rotors, and ran the message through her grid. Suddenly the page filled with German words buried inside the noise. Coordinates, times, artillery markers, armoured divisions. Mary's pencil froze mid-stroke. "Captain," she said, her voice dropping, "this is the order for a coordinated mortar and panzer ambush. The target is exactly where the 8th Corps is marching." Turner's blood drained from his face. He grabbed the decoded segment, scanned it, then barked at the nearest officer, "Get Schaeff on the line." "Move now." Mary added quietly, "They plan to strike at 0420 hours. Turner looked up sharply. "How much time does that give us?" She checked the clock. Less than 2 hours, and that's if the roads hold. The room exploded into controlled panic phones, ringing officers running messages transmitted across the Atlantic at breakneck speed. But even as chaos erupted, Mary remained motionless, one hand resting lightly on the now opened Cipher. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of war settle fully on her shoulders. She had not fired a weapon. She had not seen a battlefield. But she had deciphered a plan designed to wipe out 20,000 men. She whispered to herself, "Not tonight." The room had exploded into motion the moment Mary identified the outline of the German ambush, but for her the true work was only beginning. The partial decrypt she produced was enough to raise alarms, but not enough to give Allied command the complete clarity needed to issue a decisive counter-order. A misinterpreted coordinate, a mistaken timing marker, even a single flawed transcription could reroute entire regiments into new danger. Turner knew this. The War Department liaison knew it, and Mary knew it more than anyone. The partial decrypt might save thousands, the full decrypt could save tens of thousands. While officers relayed the warning to Schaeff, Mary returned to the Cipher with renewed intensity. She no longer focused on the broad structure. She needed the details, the precision that made German directives both lethal and predictable. If she could locate the original offset created by the operator's mistake, she could reconstruct the entire rotor path from the moment he struck the wrong key to the moment the message ended. It would allow her to collapse the entire Cipher into a readable timeline. She leaned in, steadying her breath. Her pencil danced between the fragments she'd already decoded and the dense blocks of impossible symbols that still remained untouched. She whispered the sequence to herself, an incantation of logic she had repeated since her training. Every machine leaves a shadow, every mistake leaves a door. Turner stood behind her again. He didn't interrupt. He knew that at this moment any distraction could fracture the thin line Mary walked between insight and noise. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. She circled 2 additional anomalies that she had overlooked in the rush of the last minutes, clusters of characters in the first and third pages that reflected the same structural deformation. The operator hadn't made one mistake. He had made 3, and if she could isolate the spacing between the mistakes, she could reassemble the entire stepping sequence. A spark ignited behind her eyes. "The drift is rhythmic," she said softly. Turner frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the operator paused. Look here, these clusters aren't errors of typing speed, they're errors of interruption." He lifted his fingers twice, probably to check the original message or warm his hands. When he returned, the rotors had stepped without him accounting for it. Turner stared at her. "Can you reverse it?" She didn't answer immediately. She moved the 3 anomaly clusters into a separate grid and began counting the interval between each. 37 groups between the first and second, 40 between the second and third. She ran those sequences through her internal mapping of the HL stepping pattern. As she did, the alignment snapped into place. She exhaled in a tremor she didn't intend. "Yes," she said, "I can reverse it." She recalculated the rotor progression with the corrected timing, accounted for plugboard substitutions, and applied the estimated operator drift. Then she opened page 1 again. At first it still looked like noise, a wall of jagged characters. But as she layered the corrections onto it, the noise softened. Patterns emerged. German words flickered into visibility between the fragments. Then entire sentences. Mary struck through the first 3 groups. "Captain," she said without lifting her eyes, "this isn't just an ambush order. This is a full multi-division operation timeline." Turner leaned closer. "How large?" 2 Panzer divisions, 1 Volksgrenadier division, coordinated air support once the weather breaks, and she stopped. Turner's voice tightened. "And what?" She tapped the second paragraph, her pencil still trembling from the speed. "They're planning to encircle the 8th Corps and push deeper toward the Meuse. This isn't about one attack. This is the blueprint for the entire second phase of their offensive." Turner's jaw clamped shut. If the Germans reached the Meuse River, the Allies risked losing months of progress and possibly the entire northern front. A breakthrough there could force a withdrawal across Belgium and fracture Allied command cohesion. The cost would be unthinkable. Mary didn't look up. She didn't have time to feel the shock. She needed the last element, the execution timing. High-level German orders always included a final 2-line indicator specifying when the directive became active. Without that, Schaeff couldn't determine whether the Germans were preparing to strike immediately or staging for a delayed assault. She flipped to the bottom of the 3rd page. There it was, an incomplete block of characters distorted by the operator's earlier drift. She corrected the block, manually substituting each symbol with its expected HL output based on the reconstructed alignment. The block opened. Her breath caught in her throat. "Captain Turner," she said, her voice low but firm. The full directive activates in stages, but the ambush on the 8th Corps begins at exactly 0420 hours. That gives us, she checked the wall clock again, just under 2 hours. The room fell into a stunned collective stillness. Then Turner snapped into motion. "Get this to the War Department, now, and patch Schaeff again. We need field relays ready in 5 minutes. But Mary wasn't finished. She pushed the papers aside and grabbed the faint, barely legible carbon sheet beneath the 2nd page. Something had bothered her earlier, a tiny irregularity she hadn't had time to address. A sequence of characters repeated 4 times in the final third of the cipher. She'd assumed it was plugboard echo, but now, with the rotor alignment reconstructed, she realized it reflected something else, a duplication sequence used only in German Nachtfeuer protocols, night fire coordination signals for artillery. She recalculated the group and felt the air leave her lungs. "Captain," she said softly, "the Germans will begin their artillery barrage 30 minutes before the armoured divisions move." Turner turned. When? 0350. Turner looked back at the clock. That gives Schaeff 1 hour and 17 minutes. Mary slid the final corrected grid across the table toward him, and that, she said, is the exact point at which 20,000 American soldiers would have died. For a long moment, no one moved. Officers stared at the decrypted directive with a mixture of disbelief and dread, as if holding a map to a graveyard that, thanks to a single woman at a single desk, might remain empty. Then the room erupted. Phones rang, messengers ran, orders flew across the Atlantic. Mary sat back for the first time since she'd begun. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together until they steadied. In all the chaos, one quiet truth settled inside her. She had done it. Against the clock, against the machine, against the war. She'd opened the enemy's plan before the enemy could execute it. And somewhere in the frozen dark of the Ardennes, 20,000 men were unknowingly walking one step back from death. The decrypted directive reached the War Department within minutes, carried by a blur of runners whose boots hammered the linoleum floors of Arlington Hall like distant artillery. Turner's voice echoed down corridors as he relayed Mary's findings to every official with the authority to move a division. By 2:45 a.m., the message had crossed secure transatlantic channels and landed in the hands of Schaeff operations officers outside Paris. Most of them were exhausted, hunched over maps of Belgium, illuminated by weak desk lamps, trying to make sense of the German offensive tearing through the Ardennes. But the moment the directive's contents were read aloud, fatigue evaporated. One officer whispered, "If this is accurate, we're standing on the edge of a catastrophe." Another replied, "No, on the edge of avoiding one." Within minutes, orders changed. Telephones rang across field headquarters buried in snow. Radio operators jolted awake, scrambling to adjust frequencies dampened by the winter storm. Motorcyclists were dispatched down ice-covered roads to relay new movement commands to units whose radios had gone silent. The 8th Corps, still advancing cautiously through terrain they thought was only lightly contested, received the halt and divert order with disbelief. Their commanding officers had seen sporadic resistance, but nothing to suggest the scale of the assault now bearing down on them. Some questioned the authenticity, others questioned the timing, but the order was clear, marked with the highest level of urgency: pull back 2 miles, immediately reposition along fallback coordinates, and prepare for heavy artillery. What none of them yet knew was how close the German trap truly was. 40 miles from their position in a forest clearing covered with a thick white crust of snow, German mortar teams were loading shells with mechanical precision. Their orders, issued through the very directive Mary had just unlocked, dictated a precise firing sequence, a 30-minute artillery curtain, at 0350 hours, followed by the advance of 2 panzer divisions at dawn. Coordinated radio silence ensured the Americans would receive no forewarning. The Germans believed the 8th Corps would be marching directly into the kill zone by the time the first shells fell. They had every reason to trust their plan. Enigma had remained unbroken for months. No one on their side imagined that a young American woman in a building thousands of miles away had pulled the entire operation apart in under 14 minutes. Meanwhile, back at SHAEF headquarters, officers pored over Mary's decrypted content. They cross-referenced grid coordinates with updated reconnaissance maps, verifying the exact ambush points. A thick silence settled over the command tent when they confirmed the alignment. The Germans had planned to strike with devastating accuracy. If the 8th Corps had continued along its original path, it would have walked into a perfect line of fire mortars positioned to blanket the road machine gun nests covering both flanks and armoured divisions, poised to seal the trap once the barrage ended. The attack would have shattered the American line-split Allied forces and opened the route to the Meuse River. The entire northern front would have buckled. Instead, because of a single decrypt made before dawn, the Americans vanished from the kill zone as if erased by the storm itself. At 0348 hours 2 minutes before the scheduled mortar fire, the German batteries confirmed final coordinates. Their officers peered through field glasses scanning for movement. The snowfall was dense, but they expected to see shadows, columns, the faint silhouettes of marching men. They saw nothing, but war often delivered uncertainty in its final moments. Many assumed the Americans were merely obscured by the blizzard. The order to fire remained unchanged. At 0350 hours, the forest exploded. Barrages of shells rained onto empty snow-covered ground. The blast ripped open the earth, sending geysers of dirt and ice into the air. Trees splintered. Craters bloomed in rapid sequence. But there were no screams, no scattering troops, no collapsing lines. German spotters narrowed their eyes in confusion. Where the hell were the Americans? Had they lost their way? The barrage continued for the full 30 minutes, each shell a furious strike at an enemy that was no longer there. At 0420 hours, the panzer divisions rolled forward, engines growling in the pre-dawn dark. Their tracks churned through shredded earth and smoking pine roots. But as they advanced, something happened that no German planner had accounted for. Because the Americans had shifted their position earlier than expected, they had accidentally redirected German armour into a mine-laced forest edge that engineering units had been preparing days prior. The Germans had no updated maps. They believed they were pursuing a fleeing opponent. Instead, they were driving straight into the edges of an unmarked hazard zone. The first tank detonated a buried mine with a deafening boom that shook snow from the surrounding branches. The second tried to swerve around the charred crater and struck another. Panic rippled down the line. 2 more tanks hit mines in the span of 8 minutes. Forced to halt, armoured commanders attempted to manoeuvre backward, but the terrain had softened from the artillery barrage, turning the forest floor into a pit of mud and wreckage. Visibility dropped again as freezing fog rolled in. What should have been a crushing decisive strike turned into a stalled advance littered with crippled machinery. Communications collapsed. German officers shouted conflicting orders, and the Americans, now positioned safely on higher ground, watched the chaos unfold from concealed positions. By dawn, SHAEF had received confirmation that the German assault in that sector had failed catastrophically. The 8th Corps had suffered almost no casualties, and the panzer divisions had lost mobility during their most critical push of the campaign. Back in Arlington Hall, Mary sat quietly as Turner relayed the final field reports. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatise, he simply said the 8th Corps is safe. They pulled out in time. She felt the words heavy and quiet settle inside her. She wasn't elated. She wasn't triumphant. She simply felt the fragile relief of someone who had held lives in her hands and not lost them. Later that morning, Turner filed the official report. It included a single line beneath the decrypted message code cracked in 14 minutes. Analyst Collins M. No medals, no speeches, no recognition, but the front line in Europe had shifted because of her, and 20,000 American soldiers would live to see another sunrise. In the days that followed, Arlington Hall returned to its usual rhythm of controlled chaos, the hum of decoding machines spinning through thousands of permutations, the sharp scent of ink from freshly typed intercepts, the clatter of carts rolling down hallways carrying classified documents to rooms sealed with steel doors. But for Mary Collins, the atmosphere felt different, as if an invisible thread now connected her to the battlefield she would never see. The rescue of the 8th Corps didn't appear in newspapers. No broadcast mentioned the sudden survival of 20,000 men. To the outside world, nothing had happened at all. Yet inside Arlington Hall, whispers moved from unit to unit. Officers nodded respectfully as Mary passed. Analysts glanced her way, some with admiration and some with quiet curiosity. But no one spoke openly. They weren't allowed to. Silence was the first rule of their war. Mary returned to her desk, surrounded by the same grey walls and the same soft glow of lamps that had lit the room the night she cracked the impossible Enigma chain. A new intercept waited. Another German transmission already demanded attention. There was no celebration, no moment to stand still. Her work continued because the war continued, but the weight of what she had prevented pressed against her thoughts. 20,000 men marching through snow, unaware of how close they had come to becoming names on casualty lists. She imagined their faces young, old, frightened, determined. She would never meet them and they would never know her name. That anonymity, both unbearable and essential, defined the invisible army she belonged to. Arlington Hall was filled with women like her, mathematicians, statisticians, linguists, schoolteachers, who knew more Latin than most officers' musicians, whose perfect pitch helped them identify radio patterns, and farm girls who became experts in enemy logistics. They worked 16-hour shifts fueled by weak coffee and the knowledge that any mistake could cost lives. They carried the war in their minds, not their hands. They had no uniforms, no battlefield glory, no medals pinned in public. Their victories were classified, their contributions sealed in documents marked restricted and never to be acknowledged. Yet no artillery barrage, no division of tanks, no air raid could shape the war as sharply as the information they extracted from a block of numbered letters. Mary often thought of that contradiction. Codebreakers were soldiers without rifles, fighters who would never fire a single bullet, but whose calculations could alter the course of a campaign. They didn't advance through mud, they didn't face machine gun nests, but their battleground was just as unforgiving. A single wrong assumption could misdirect an entire division. A single unnoticed pattern could doom thousands. And still, when the war ended, combat soldiers would be celebrated, while people like Mary would return to civilian life as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The night after her decrypt changed the Ardennes sector, Mary walked outside the building for fresh air. Snow coated the courtyard in soft layers. The distant landscape of Arlington was silent except for the rhythm of guards pacing along the perimeter. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small piece of carbon paper she'd kept from the Enigma message. The fragment that captured the moment the machine yielded. To anyone else, it was nothing but smudge markings. To her, it was proof that intellect, not firepower, had shifted the direction of a battle. She folded the paper carefully and put it back. As she looked up, she wondered how many other women across Britain and America were performing the same invisible labour. At Bletchley Park, thousands worked through endless lines of ciphers inside cold huts. In Washington, OSS analysts broke codes coming from Tokyo. Across the Pacific, female radio operators intercepted enemy transmissions in languages most Americans couldn't pronounce. They were scattered across continents unknown to one another, connected only by shared secrecy and the knowledge that their minds were their weapon. The power of their work extended far beyond any single battle. It represented a transformation in warfare itself. World War II had made clear that the age of pure muscle and steel was over. The wars of the future would be decided by information, by who could collect it, interpret it, and act on it faster. What Mary accomplished in 14 minutes proved that the margins between survival and annihilation were now measured in calculations, not brigades. Her decrypt was not simply an act of intelligence, it was a statement about the evolving nature of human conflict. But on a more intimate level, Mary's contribution symbolized something else entirely: the erasure of limits placed on women by a world that believed war was a man's domain. She had not chosen to defy expectations, she had simply done what needed to be done. But her success cracked open a door that had been sealed for generations. It showed that dedication, discipline, and intellect belonged to no gender. It showed that the capacity to alter history was not confined to trenches and front lines. It could live in quiet rooms lit by desk lamps in hands that held pencils instead of rifles. As war historians would later write, a rifle can alter the fate of a battle, but a pencil can alter the fate of a generation. Mary returned inside, took her place at her desk, and prepared for the next intercept. The war was far from over. There would be more nights, more crises, more impossible ciphers. She would face each of them as she had this one, quietly, methodically, without expecting thanks. That was the nature of her service. That was the legacy of every woman who fought without ever stepping onto a battlefield. When the war finally ended and the world erupted in celebration, Arlington Hall did not. Its doors remained locked, its lights remained low, and the people who had shaped battles with nothing more than logic and resolve walked out quietly, their service sealed behind decades of classification. Mary Collins was among them. She carried no medals, no commendations, no official record of the night she saved 20,000 American soldiers. All she carried was a folded piece of carbon paper from a German cipher and the memory of a decision made at 2:14 a.m. in a room that smelled of ink and worry. The country celebrated victory without ever knowing who had helped make it possible. Years later, long after the battlefield guns rusted and the headlines faded, a historian uncovered fragments of the Arlington Hall archives. Among them was a thin file barely a few pages long labelled simply Collins M. It contained no praise, no detail of her skill, not even the transcript of the Enigma intercept she had cracked. Only a single line under significant contribution stood out stark and understated. Analyst demonstrated exceptional performance under time-sensitive conditions. It was the kind of sentence bureaucracies write when they do not know how to capture heroism without breaking protocol, and yet that single sentence represented an entire front of the war, a front fought with intellect instead of artillery, with pencils instead of rifles, with silence instead of glory. It represented the thousands of codebreakers whose work would never be fully acknowledged. It represented Mary, who had carried the weight of lives she would never meet. So the question becomes unavoidable. How should we remember people like her? Should recognition depend on uniforms and medals? Or should it depend on impact on the reality that sometimes the quietest victory is the one that prevents a slaughter before it begins? If you believe the true power of war has always come from the mind rather than the muscle, comment the number 7 right now. If you disagree, if you believe history is shaped on the battlefield and nowhere else, then hit the like button. Either way, your voice matters here. Before you leave, consider one final thought. Somewhere in Europe, a soldier who lived because Mary intercepted a signal returned home, married, raised children, built a life that would not have existed without a decision she made in 14 minutes. Multiply that by 20,000. That is the legacy of a woman whose name most Americans have never heard. If stories like this one matter to you, stories of forgotten intelligence, hidden courage, and the people who shaped World War II from the shadows, then subscribe. Join the community preserving these histories before they vanish again. And as you do answer this, should the greatest victories be the ones we never see,